Imagine a world where the only church you knew was the one that ruled everything, your thoughts, your actions, and even your dreams. This was Europe in the 16th century, where the Catholic Church held an iron grip on people's lives. But then, something extraordinary happened. A storm of change swept across the land, and it all started with a few brave individuals who dared to question the old ways. In 1554, the idea of a Reformed church was just a whisper in the wind. It could only be found in a few isolated pockets of Switzerland and the Holy Roman Empire. But by 1600, this whisper had turned into a roar. Reformed churches had spread like wildfire from Britain to Transylvania, transforming the religious landscape of Europe. In Hungary, the Reformed churches were a beacon of hope for those who felt suffocated by the old system. They adopted documents like Calvin's Catechism, the Second Helvetic Confession, and the Heidelberg Catechism, showing that they were in harmony with their Reformed counterparts in the West. But the way they worshipped was different. In the Trans-Tibiscan district, they followed Ludwig Lavater's guide, stripping their churches of images and altars, eliminating clerical vestments, and reducing holidays to just 6. In other parts of Hungary, the Reformed churches kept more of the old Catholic traditions, showing that change wasn't always uniform. Church discipline was a big deal. In some places, like the cities under Turkish rule, the Qadi, a judge, would handle punishments. In Habsburg-controlled areas, the local lords took charge. In Transylvania, the bailiff was the one who enforced the rules. This meant that the Reformed churches in Hungary had a unique mix of local and foreign influences, making them different from the churches in Geneva or the Presbyterial synodal model in the West. The Reformed churches didn't just pop up overnight. They grew through a mix of defiance and support. In some places like Scotland and the Netherlands, people fought for their right to worship freely. In other places, like parts of Germany, the rulers themselves embraced the Reformed faith and changed their churches from the top down. Each church had its own flavor, from the strict discipline of the Scottish and Dutch churches to the more lenient approach of the French worship styles varied widely. In England, people knelt to receive communion from a surplice-wearing minister. In France, they filed by their minister, who wore a simple gown. In the Netherlands and Scotland, they sat at a table as elders passed around the bread and wine. Some churches, like the Scottish ones, got rid of all holy days, while others kept some traditions, like abstaining from meat on Fridays. The way these churches were governed also differed. In some places, like France, the local churches were the building blocks, and the higher assemblies were more about solving conflicts and making sure everything ran smoothly. In the Netherlands, the classes, regional assemblies, became the backbone of the church, handling everything from appointing ministers to dealing with difficult discipline cases. In Scotland, the presbyteries were the key players, handling serious discipline issues and even excommunicating people when necessary. In Poland and Hungary, the church structure was different again. They had area, district, and national synods, but no parish-level consistorial assemblies. Superintendents, or bishops, played a crucial role, overseeing the churches and helping approve new ministers. In Hungary, they even had archdeacons, who had the power to visit and correct the parish clergy. In England, things were even more unique. The Church of England kept its old Catholic structure, with bishops, archdeacons, and parish clergy. But it also embraced Reformed theology. The balance between the old and the new was a constant struggle, with each bishop deciding how to blend their traditional role with their new Protestant duties. The Reformed churches of the 16th century were a patchwork of different ideas, practices, and structures. But one thing was clear: they were a force to be reckoned with. From the mountains of Scotland to the plains of Hungary, these churches were reshaping the religious and political landscape of Europe, one parish at a time. In the late 1500s, a group of Englishmen felt that the Church of England was too flawed to stay in. They believed the Church needed a proper system to discipline its members, and that some of its practices weren't supported by the Bible. These people thought the Church was so blemished that they had to leave it. However, this was a very small group. Most Reformed Church members believed that different ways of worship and church governance were allowed and shouldn't break the unity among true churches. William Bradshaw wrote in 1606 that all churches and their members, no matter where they were part of one big family because they were all citizens of heaven. The Reformed churches showed their unity in many ways. One way was by helping each other during tough times. When the Duke of Savoy tried to take over Geneva in the 1590s, churches in Scotland, England, France, and other parts of Europe collected money to help defend Geneva. Even some Lutheran and anti-Trinitarian groups in Eastern Europe contributed. When Geneva needed help, it had previously collected funds for people leaving the Palatinate, and for those in Montpellier who were suffering from plague and famine. When money wasn't enough, they turned to prayer. In 1595, the Church of Scotland called for a day of fasting to pray for the safety of their Reformed brothers in Poland, England, Saxony, and other parts of Germany. Many Reformed ministers moved between countries, which helped bind the churches together. Jean Taffin, a famous devotional writer, is a good example. Born in Tournai, he first worked for Cardinal Granvelle, but later joined the Reformed cause. He helped the church in Antwerp, then went to Strasbourg and Geneva to prepare for ministry. He served in Aachen, Metz, and Heidelberg, where he wrote his most important book. He became William of Orange's chaplain and later served in Antwerp and Haarlem before settling in Amsterdam. Even after the Reformed churches became more stable in the early 1600s, ministers and theologians continued to move across borders. For example, 9 out of 20 professors at the Reformed Academy of Saumur between 1599 and 1625 came from outside France. The Reformed churches also showed their unity by consulting each other on theological questions, confirming each other's confessions of faith, and trying to create documents that showed their shared beliefs. The Reformed churches in France and the Netherlands, having similar histories, formed close ties. In 1571, the Synod of Emden approved both the French and Belgic confessions for use in the Low Countries, and in 1579, the French churches approved the Belgic Confession. In 1583, Dutch clergy attended the French National Synod, and both churches promised to help each other in times of need. They even agreed to send representatives to each other's national synods, though this didn't always happen. When theological disputes arose, the Reformed churches sought advice from a wide range of sources. In 1598, the French National Synod asked churches in Bern, Zurich, Schaffhausen, Heidelberg, and other places to send representatives to discuss controversial ideas. In 1618, the Synod of Dordrecht, which aimed to resolve the Arminian controversy, included delegates from England, Scotland, Geneva, and many German Reformed territories. The absence of French delegates was due to the Crown's prohibition, and the Hungarians and Poles were not included because they lacked prestigious universities. In 1577, John Casimir of the Palatinate and Wilhelm of Hesse organized a meeting in Frankfurt to respond to Lutheran efforts to promote the Formula of Concord. The result was the Harmony of Confessions, published in Geneva in 1581, which showed the many points of agreement among 11 confessions of faith. This document was approved by the churches of France, the Low Countries, and Bremen, but it faced some challenges. The English authorities refused to approve the vernacular translation because it suggested that church discipline should be in the hands of presbyteries or consistories. The Czech brethren were upset that their confession was included without their permission. Despite these challenges, the Reformed churches often sought to include Lutheran churches in their fellowship. For example, the French Reformed allowed visiting Lutherans to participate in their communion services, and a Haarlem minister listed Reformed churches in Lutheran countries like Denmark and Sweden. However, when it came to theological consultations, the French, Dutch, and Swiss sought advice only from universities that aligned with Reformed doctrine. The Reformed cause also influenced political actions. Political Calvinism, the belief that defending Protestantism was essential to saving the true faith, shaped the policies of leaders like the Earl of Leicester in England, Christian of Anhalt in Germany, and Philippe du Plessis-Mornay in France. This worldview led to actions like Queen Elizabeth's support for the Dutch rebels in the 1580s and Frederick V's acceptance of the Bohemian crown in 1618, which started the 30 Years' War. However, not all Reformed rulers agreed. James VI and I of England, for example, resisted calls to involve himself in religious conflicts. Despite their differences in worship, governance, and political views, the Reformed churches shared a strong sense of fellowship. They exchanged personnel, shared communion, and consulted each other on doctrine. They offered prayers and financial support in times of need. This sense of unity would be tested in the years to come, but it remained a powerful force. In the following decades, the Reformed tradition continued to evolve. New doctrines and practices emerged, such as the High Predestinarian Orthodoxy, summarized by the acronym TULIP, the disciplined piety of the Puritan way of godliness, and the militant defense of a self-governing church. These changes often arose from internal debates and the need to systematize doctrine. As the Reformed churches became more established, they faced new challenges in transmitting their beliefs to future generations. The use of formal logic, once rejected by early reformers, became more common, leading to more detailed systems of orthodoxy. However, these systems were often contested, and new theological and philosophical currents challenged traditional views. By the end of the 1600s, a new theological rationalism was reshaping Reformed doctrine in many regions. The world of the Reformed churches changed a lot during the 16th and 17th centuries. These changes came from both inside and outside the churches, and they made the Reformed faith more diverse and complex. Inside the churches, there were tensions between the way things were set up after the first wave of reform and the ideal church that later Reformed thinkers imagined. For example, in England, church leaders felt they lacked a strong system to discipline members and promote a moral life, like the ones used in Geneva or Zurich. When they realized they couldn't change the church's structure quickly, they started to find other ways to encourage good behavior and personal devotion. In Hungary, church leaders were upset because their church still had some old Catholic practices and they didn't have a system to discipline parish members. In the Netherlands, ministers were frustrated because they had little influence on public affairs. These issues led to campaigns for further reform, often inspired by what was happening in England. External events also played a big role. In places where different religions were tolerated, the attitude of the ruling authorities could greatly affect the Reformed churches. For instance, in the Netherlands and Transylvania, the Reformed churches grew because they had political protection. This encouraged members to push for more reforms. But in countries like France, Hungary, and Poland, Lithuania, where Catholicism was the official religion, the Reformed churches faced increasing pressure. Catholic rulers sometimes revoked legal protection for the Reformed faith, forcing members to choose between converting, leaving, or resisting. Another significant change was the shift in religious loyalty among some Protestant rulers and nobles. Around 1590, some began to convert to Catholicism, attracted by the grandeur and tradition of the Roman Church. This led to the loss of several small Reformed principalities to Catholic or Lutheran control. These changes tested the loyalty of Reformed church members depending on how the church was set up and how long it had been established. In the British Isles, the union of the crowns of England and Scotland in 1603 brought two different churches under one king. The Stuart monarchs tried to make the churches more uniform, following the English model, which was moving away from the Reformed tradition. This upset the Scots and led to open resistance. The crisis spread to England, where King Charles I's religious policies sparked a constitutional confrontation and eventually a civil war. During this time, the structure of the English church was challenged, and the idea of communion became more exclusive. The unity of the church broke down, and attempts to reunite it failed. In Scotland, there were also deep divisions over political and religious commitments, which persisted even after the restoration of the Stuart monarchy and the Glorious Revolution. By 1700, the Reformed world was more diverse and divided than it had been a century earlier. It was concentrated in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Britain, but there were still debates about which parts of the English church belonged to the Reformed tradition. Theology also continued to evolve. While early historians focused on figures like Calvin, the Reformed faith didn't stop developing after the first generations. New theologians joined the ranks of the founders, shaping the beliefs of Reformed ministers and lay people. The worship practices of the later 17th century reflected both the early Reformed teachings and new ideas that emerged after Calvin's death. The late 16th and 17th centuries were a time of intense theological activity. Reformed theologians began to use more systematic and logical methods to explain their beliefs. This was partly because the churches needed to teach their doctrines clearly to new generations and to counter the sophisticated arguments of Catholic scholars. Some theologians, like Zanchi and Gomarus, used scholastic logic, while others, like Ramus, promoted a simpler anti-Aristotelian approach. The study of philosophy became more important in Reformed education, and theological teachings became more organized and systematic. One of the most debated topics was predestination. While it wasn't always the central doctrine, the more systematic approach to theology led to deeper discussions and new interpretations. Theological debates became more complex, and new distinctions were introduced to resolve apparent contradictions. This period of Reformed orthodoxy was far from monolithic, and it laid the groundwork for the diverse forms of Reformed theology that would develop in the centuries to come. During the early 1600s, debates between Protestants and Catholics became more heated. The Protestants believed in the principle of sola scriptura, which means that the Bible alone is the ultimate authority for faith and practice. However, the variety of interpretations among Protestant theologians became a powerful weapon for Catholic critics. They argued that if the Bible could be interpreted in so many different ways, how could it be a reliable source of truth? Protestant reformers like Martin Luther, Huldrych, Zwingli, and John Calvin didn't claim that every word of the Bible was divinely inspired. Instead, they believed that the essential message of salvation and key historical details were accurate. They trusted that the Holy Spirit had guided the scribes who wrote the Bible to record these truths accurately. Scholars like Erasmus and Valla had also helped recover the original texts, making it easier to understand the Bible's true message. However, as debates with Catholics intensified, some Protestant theologians began to change their views. In 1617, Amandus Paulinus von Pollensdorf, a professor in Basel, argued that the vowel points in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament were part of God's original revelation to Moses. This was a significant shift from earlier views, which accepted that these vowel points were added later to help with pronunciation. Johannes Buxtorf and Franciscus Gomarus also began to argue that the exact wording of the Bible was divinely inspired, not just the overall message. This change in thinking had a big impact on how people understood predestination. Predestination is the idea that God has already decided who will be saved and who will be damned. This raised many questions. If Christ promised salvation for all, why are only a few chosen? How can God's omnipotence and goodness be reconciled? Did God decide who would be saved and who would be damned before or after Adam's fall? Calvin had discussed predestination, but didn't go into great detail about the exact order of God's decrees. However, Theodore Beza, one of Calvin's successors, took a more detailed approach. Beza believed that God chose some for salvation and others for damnation before he even created the world. This view, known as supralapsarianism, became very influential. Beza's teachings were also popularized by William Perkins, a respected theologian in Cambridge, who created a visual chart to explain the doctrine of predestination. These ideas didn't go unchallenged. In Geneva, some of Beza's colleagues, like Charles Perrault, opposed his views. In England, Samuel Harsnet preached against the idea of double predestination, arguing that it made God responsible for sin. Archbishop Whitgift, however, supported the more predestinarian views. In Bern, Switzerland, a debate at the Colloquy of Montbéliard in 1586 between Theodore Beza and Jacob Andrié of Tübingen ended in bitter disagreement. Samuel Huber, a critic of Beza's teachings, was eventually banished from Bern for calling predestination blasphemous. The controversy spread to other parts of Europe, including England and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the debate took on a new life. Jacob Arminius, a young minister in Amsterdam, was asked to critique a treatise against Beza's supralapsarianism. As he studied the issue, Arminius developed his own views, which were quite different from Beza's. Arminius argued that individuals could lose their salvation if they did not persevere in faith. He also believed that God's decision to save or condemn people came after the fall, not before, a view known as infrasalapsarianism. When Arminius became a professor at Leiden University in 1603, the debate intensified. His colleague, Franciscus Gomarus, who supported Beza's views, began to publicly challenge Arminius. Students and local ministers joined the debate, and the controversy grew so intense that there were calls for a national synod to resolve the matter. These debates showed how deeply the issue of predestination affected people's faith. For some, the doctrine of predestination was a source of comfort, assuring them of God's unchanging love. For others, it was a cause of anxiety, making them wonder if they were among the chosen few. The discussions also revealed how theological debates could lead to new and sometimes controversial ideas, shaping the way people understood their faith for generations to come. The Arminian controversy started as a debate about predestination, but it quickly grew into something much bigger. When a professor's teachings were called into question, it reawakened old disputes about who should have control over church affairs. This was a big deal because the Dutch church had been dealing with these issues since its early days. Arminius, the professor at the center of the controversy, had a wife from an influential family in Amsterdam. When he was asked to appear before the Amsterdam consistory, he refused unless the city's leaders, the burgomasters, were present. This showed that he believed the civil authorities, not just the church, should have a say in these matters. His supporters agreed, arguing that city governments should control church appointments and that the national government, the states, should decide the format and agenda for a national synod. On the other side, Arminius's opponents, known as the Gomarists, insisted that the church should be independent and have the final say in all matters of doctrine. They believed that the Church's existing confessional documents, like the Belgic Confession of Faith and the Heidelberg Catechism, were sacred and should not be changed. The debate also raised questions about whether these confessional documents were final or if they could be revised. Arminius and his supporters thought the documents should be reconsidered, while the Gomarists saw any changes as dangerous and unnecessary. They argued that these documents had been used for decades and were even defended by martyrs. The conflict grew more intense when the secular authorities, led by Johann van Oldenbarnevelt, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, tried to intervene. They wanted to call a national synod that would be controlled by the states and would consider revising the Church's confessional documents. The Church's synods opposed this, leading to a deadlock. The situation became even more complicated when local church bodies started taking matters into their own hands, suspending ministers who refused to sign the Belgic Confession. One example of this conflict happened in Alkmaar between 1608 and 1610. The local church body suspended 5 pastors for not signing the confession. The city's leaders defended the pastors, and the situation escalated to the point where the city council was replaced and a new consistory was installed. This led to splits within the church and even within the city, with some residents attending services in nearby villages. Arminius died in 1609, but the controversy continued to grow. In 1610, 44 ministers signed a document called the Remonstrance, which laid out their key beliefs and called for a national synod to address the issues. They believed in the election of believers by God's grace, the universality of Christ's atonement, and the resistibility of grace. They also supported the authority of the secular government over the Church and called for the revision of the Belgic Confession. In response, the Gomarists wrote a counter-remonstrance, which defended their own views, including limited atonement and the perseverance of the saints. The debate became more public, with a growing number of publications in both Latin and Dutch, making the issues more volatile. The Remonstrants, despite having support from influential figures like Oldenbarnevelt, were a minority within the clergy. They managed to block attempts to remove them from their positions and to call a clerically dominated national synod. Oldenbarnevelt tried to calm the situation by issuing rules that forbade ministers from discussing the controversial topics in their sermons and by requiring tolerance of all views until a national synod could be held. However, these measures only made the Gomarists more upset, as they saw it as an invasion of the Church's independence. The tension reached a breaking point when Maurice of Nassau, the leader of the House of Orange, sided with the Gomarists. In 1617, he attended a service with a group of contra-remonstrants who had taken over an abandoned church. Oldenbarnevelt and the states of Holland responded by allowing cities to hire their own troops to enforce their religious policies. This was a direct challenge to Maurice's authority, and he moved quickly to regain control. He dismissed the special troops and purged supporters of Oldenbarnevelt from the city councils. Oldenbarnevelt and some of his allies were arrested, and Oldenbarnevelt was eventually executed. With the pro-remonstrant leaders out of the way, a national synod was finally called in Dordrecht in 1618. The synod was dominated by the contra-remonstrants, but it also included delegates from other Reformed churches in Europe. The synod examined the 5 key points of the remonstrance and ultimately rejected the main Arminian positions. They affirmed the doctrine of predestination, but avoided the extreme views of Gomarus. The synod declared that God chose the elect before the foundation of the world, and that this election was not based on any foreknowledge of the individual's actions. They also emphasized the power of divine grace and the assurance of salvation for the elect. The decisions of the synod were accepted by the States General and sent to the provincial synods for all clergymen to sign. those who refused to sign, about 200 in total, were removed from their positions. Some were banished from the country, while others were allowed to stay if they agreed to live quietly as private citizens. The Arminian controversy had far-reaching consequences, not just for the Dutch Church, but for the broader Reformed tradition. It highlighted the complex interplay between religious and political power, and the deep theological divisions that could arise within a community. Despite the Synod's decisions, the debate over predestination and the nature of God's grace continued to shape religious and political life in the Netherlands and beyond. Matters were still unsettled in Dort when the leading Remonstrant clergymen realized they would no longer be accepted in the main Dutch church. They decided that if they were banned from using public churches, they would hold meetings, like the Martinists and Mennonites, in private homes. After the party leaders were banished, a group met in Antwerp in September 1619 and formed what became known as the Remonstrant Brotherhood. They deliberately avoided calling it a church to show that they were an association of people unjustly driven out of the public church. The Brotherhood committed to supporting the communities of believers left behind by providing preaching and the administration of the sacraments. They set up a secret fundraising system to pay stipends to ministers inside the country and in exile. In the following year, Simon Episcopius, who was becoming their chief theological spokesman, wrote what would remain the Brotherhood's essential confession of faith until the late 18th century. This confession was unique because it advised accepting its precepts only if they could be confirmed by conscience and Scripture. It should not be cited in conferences or disputes as authoritative, while recognizing the need for synods to discuss issues of doctrine, worship, and manners. The confession rejected imposing the decisions of such synods on anyone by law. It defended the right of believers to gather for worship on their own. The confession was critical of double predestination, emphasizing God's mercy over His justice and stressing that believers needed to persevere in faith to be saved. Despite rejecting Lutheran and Catholic doctrines of the Eucharist and criticizing idolatry, the confession adhered to the Reformed tradition. It carefully avoided pronouncing on matters of disagreement within the Reformed tradition, such as Christ's spiritual presence in the Lord's Supper, or the exact details of church organization prescribed by Scripture. The Brotherhood struggled for nearly a decade. The outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618 and the renewal of war with Spain in 1621 increased official suspicion of the Remonstrants, who were associated with inaction against the Catholic enemy. During the 12 Years' Truce, the authorities enforced laws against Remonstrant assemblies, and exiled ministers held clandestine gatherings in private homes. Those caught faced imprisonment, and many lost heart. Gradually, events created a space for the Remonstrants to gain de facto toleration. The death of Maurice of Nassau in 1625 and his succession by the more tolerant Frederick Henry, the improvement of the Republic's military situation after 1628, and the retreat of the Catholic cause in Germany after Sweden's entry into the 30 Years' War were crucial. In 1630, the Remonstrants built their first permanent house church in Amsterdam. 4 years later, they opened a small seminary with Episcopius as professor of theology. By the 1630s to 1700, the number of functioning Remonstrant congregations ranged between 30 and 40. Rotterdam had the largest church, with about 7,000 members, in 1670. Amsterdam, the second pillar of the movement, had roughly 1,500 church members throughout the century, less than 1% of the city's population by the end of the century. Haarlem's church was more typical, with about 100 members. In total, the Remonstrants numbered between 20,000 and 40,000, mostly in South Holland. Many members came from substantial families, and the movement's possession of a seminary gave it intellectual importance beyond its size. Outside the Netherlands, the Reformed churches closely followed the debate between the Remonstrants and Contra-Remonstrants. Many accepted the Dort decrees. The Huguenot Academy of Sedan saw continual riots between student supporters of the two parties, until the 1623 decision of the National Synod of the French Reformed churches to accept the Dordrecht canons. The overwhelming majority of French ministers complied, although a few, like Daniel Tylenius and Etienne de Courcelles, lost their posts. The Genevan Company of Pastors similarly required all ministers to subscribe to the Dort decrees in 1647. While not formally adopted in Scotland or German-speaking Switzerland, the Dort decrees were highly revered there in England. The reaction was different. Men like Peter Barrow and William Barrett had already anticipated many of Arminius's theses, though they were a minority. The 1620s saw a shift in royal policy that allowed these ideas to be expressed again, leading to a movement often labeled Arminianism. English Arminianism focused more on worship, the sacraments, and the status of the clergy than on predestination. However, the Dutch debates influenced English controversies in two ways. First, Arminius's writings confirmed and possibly enriched the arguments of the English followers of Barrow and Barrett. Second, the condemnation of Arminius at Dort gave opponents a label to stigmatize the movement. Loyal disciples of Barrow, like Lancelot Andrewes and John Overall, contacted Remonstrants who came to England between 1611 and 1614 to present their ideas to King James. James's support for the Synod of Dort reminded them to be cautious, but as the 30 Years' War heated up, royal policy shifted. James sought to avoid war by encouraging mediation and a Spanish marriage for his son. This shift brought him closer to a current of opinion that saw the Puritans as subversive and was willing to protect anti-predestinarian arguments. In 1624, Richard Montague, a Cambridge scholar, published A New Gag for an Old Goose, defending the Church of England by denying it taught doctrines like unconditional election and the perseverance of the saints. Montague's work provoked numerous rebuttals, and a conference was held at York House in 1626, but it resolved nothing. Charles I, who succeeded James in 1625, supported the views of the circle around Bishop Richard Nail and named Montague a royal chaplain. Charles aimed to bring peace to the Church by banning discussion of predestination in 1626, but this was initially unsuccessful. Episcopal appointments of suspected Arminians heightened fears of reintroducing Roman doctrines, especially as Catholic forces advanced in the 30 Years' War. The Parliament of 1629 saw tumultuous scenes, and a royal decree in late 1629 ordered the strict implementation of the ban on religious controversy. The king had the power to silence theological contention that Oldenbarnevelt and the states of Holland lacked. In France, the debates about predestination opened a new chapter in the 1630s. In 1634, Moïse Aimeraut, a theology professor at the Academy of Saumur, published a vernacular brief treatise on predestination to reassure a recent convert from Catholicism. Aimeraut's treatise emphasized God's mercy while avoiding the errors censured at Dort. He espoused a middle ground called hypothetical universalism, arguing that Christ's sacrifice was for all men on condition that they believe. Faith was granted only to the elect by a second decree confirming the original conditional offer of salvation to all. Aimeraut also insisted that the doctrine of predestination be handled with care, to the dismay of those who saw it as a central consoling article of faith. Although Aimeraut's position was far from Arminianism on many points, his teachings troubled many Reformed theologians. Pierre du Moulin, a leading French dogmatician, declared that Amiraut embraced at least 2/3 of Arminianism. Amiraut was summoned to defend his views at the National Synod of Alencon in 1637, where he escaped formal censure but was advised to avoid the novelty of his expressions. Controversy arose again in 1644, when Leiden professors encouraged students to defend theses hostile to Amiraut's outlook. Polemics flew between Amiraut, Dumoulin, and Leiden professors. The Bernese forbade students from the Pays de Vaud to study at Saumur, and some French provincial synods briefly banned Saumur graduates from the ministry. In 1649, the Huguenot Duke of La Trémoille brokered a reconciliation between Amiraut and his opponents. Amiraut's views on predestination gained wide support among leading ministers in regions north of the Loire, especially in the Paris congregation of Charenton. They also influenced English ministers seeking a middle ground in the ongoing discord over predestination. However, the Geneva Company of Pastors forbade the Genevan clergy from teaching the doctrine of universal grace, and Bern enforced a ban on residents studying at Saumur until Amiraut's death. His influence in the Netherlands was minimal. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Cambridge, England was a hotbed of religious and intellectual activity. This period saw the rise of many influential figures who shaped the future of Christianity, particularly within the Reformed tradition. Among these figures were men like Richard Greenham, William Perkins, and Arthur Dent, who were part of what William Haller called the spiritual brotherhood. These men were not just scholars, but also parish ministers who were deeply concerned with the spiritual well-being of their congregations. At the heart of their work was a new approach to practical theology, which focused on how people could live out their faith in everyday life. This was a time when the hopes for a reformed church structure, like the Presbyterian system, were being crushed. Instead of relying on institutional changes, these theologians turned to voluntary means to inspire people to live more godly lives. They wrote books and treatises that were accessible to the common people, offering guidance on how to pray, meditate, and live according to the gospel. One of the key figures in this movement was William Perkins. He was a professor at Cambridge and a prolific writer whose works such as A Grain of Mustard Seed and A Treatise Tending unto a Declaration Whether a Man be in the Estate of Damnation or Salvation became incredibly popular. Perkins was known for his clear and practical approach to theology, which helped people understand complex ideas like predestination and assurance of salvation. His writings were so influential that they were published in multiple editions and even translated into other languages. Another important figure was Richard Rogers, who wrote The Seven Treatises, a comprehensive guide to Christian living. This book covered everything from how to pray and read the Bible to how to handle everyday challenges. Rogers emphasized the importance of personal assurance of salvation, encouraging his readers to examine their lives for signs of God's grace. Arthur Dent's The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven was another bestseller. It was written in the form of a dialogue between a minister and various characters, including an honest man, an ignorant man, and an atheist. Dent's book was engaging and practical, making it easy for readers to understand and apply the teachings. These works were not just about personal piety. They were also part of a larger theological debate. The authors were responding to the growing Catholic devotional literature, which was becoming increasingly popular. They wanted to provide Protestants with their own guides to pious living, ensuring that people had clear and reliable resources to turn to. The emphasis on personal assurance of salvation was a central theme in this literature. The authors believed that individuals could know from their experiences if they were among the elect. They encouraged their readers to look for signs of God's grace in their lives, such as a broken heart for sin, a love for God's word, and a desire to live a holy life. This focus on experimental predestinarianism was a way to bring comfort to believers and to reinforce the idea that faith was a gift from God. However, this emphasis on assurance also led to debates about what kind of behavior best evidenced saving faith. Some, like John Downame, argued that good works and virtuous behavior were key signs of election. Others, like John Eaton, emphasized the importance of inner experiences and the immediate work of the Holy Spirit. These debates sometimes led to conflicts, as seen in the antinomian controversy in Massachusetts, where Anne Hutchinson's teachings about immediate communion with the Spirit were seen as a threat to moral order. Despite these debates, the practical divinity movement continued to grow and evolve. By the mid-17th century, it had influenced the development of congregational churches, which restricted full membership to those who could provide a testimony of their saving faith. This practice was a significant departure from the traditional Reformed view that the visible church could not be equated with the invisible community of the elect. The movement also had an impact on the practice of baptism. Some Congregationalists and Baptists began to argue that only those who could demonstrate saving faith should be baptized, leading to the practice of adult baptism. This split the Baptist movement into two groups: the particular Baptists, who believed in predestination, and the general Baptists, who believed in a more universal offer of grace. The works of these Puritan physicians of the soul left a lasting legacy, shaping the way people understood and practiced their faith for generations to come. Their emphasis on personal piety, assurance of salvation, and practical living continues to resonate in many Christian communities today. The world of English practical divinity, a rich tapestry of religious thought and practice, was not solely defined by the doctrine of predestination. While this idea, that God has already chosen who will be saved, was a significant part of the Reformed tradition, it was just one thread in a much broader and more varied fabric. William Ames and other writers of the time, for example, didn't focus much on the idea of the elect and the reprobate. Instead, they emphasized the importance of daily piety, personal devotion, and the role of the preached word in guiding believers. They believed that attending church, listening to sermons, and discussing them with family were crucial for spiritual growth. This focus on the preached word led to a strict view of the Sabbath or Sunday as a day entirely dedicated to worship and acts of charity. This was a significant shift from earlier Reformed thinkers, who saw Sunday as a practical day of rest rather than a holy commandment. The literature of practical piety also encouraged a rich diet of private devotions. People were advised to start their day with meditation and prayer, read the Bible, and engage in psalm singing. Even mundane activities like going to the bathroom could be turned into moments of spiritual reflection. For instance, Cotton Mather, a prominent Puritan minister, used the act of urinating to reflect on the humbling nature of human life and the need to rise above it spiritually. Moral effort was another key aspect of this piety. Puritans believed that Christianity was like a trade, requiring diligence and hard work. They advised against idleness and encouraged using one's means to help others. Detailed manuals, like Richard Baxter's A Christian Directory, provided extensive guidance on how to live a holy life, covering everything from personal duties to family and community responsibilities. To reinforce these lessons, English devotional writers promoted practices like keeping spiritual diaries. These diaries were used to track one's sins, note answered prayers, and monitor spiritual progress. John Bradford, a Marian martyr, used his diary to reflect on his shortcomings and seek God's mercy. This practice of self-monitoring was a way to stay accountable and strive for continuous improvement. The rise of Cartesian philosophy in the 17th century brought new challenges to these traditional views. René Descartes, a French philosopher, introduced a new way of thinking that emphasized systematic doubt and clear, distinct ideas. While some saw his ideas as a way to strengthen faith, others, like Lodewijk Major and Baruch Spinoza, used them to question the reliability of the Bible and traditional Christian beliefs. Even those who tried to reconcile Cartesianism with Reformed theology found themselves at odds with the strict dogmas of Protestant scholasticism. In the end, the English tradition of practical divinity was a complex and multifaceted approach to religious life. It was not solely defined by predestination, but was shaped by a wide range of practices and beliefs that aimed to foster a deep personal relationship with God. This tradition continued to evolve and influence religious thought long after the 17th century, shaping the way people understood and practiced their faith